For more than 2 decades, the Ridge Racer series has delivered superlative arcade driving action with a generous side of style. It's one of the most revered arcade racing series of all time, yet as of 2021, the series has all but vanished, but not from our memories. Ridge Racer is a topic we've discussed numerous times here on DF Retro, but that topic always seems to stop with the excellent Ridge Racer 5 released in the year 2000, which is why today we're shifting gears and examining Ridge Racer's second decade, from its triumphant return on the PlayStation Portable all the way to its relatively sad ending in the mobile space. It's all here. This means, of course, we'll finally have the chance to do justice to Ridge Racer 6 and Ridge Racer 7. One of the very first examples of a comparison between Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. Both are amazing games, but how do they really compare, and what's the actual difference there? So rev your engines and get ready for a triple nitrous worth of racing action on this episode of DF Retro. Driving plus music. This is the Ridge Racer experience distilled into its most basic elements. The feeling of tackling the curves, bumper perilously close to the guardrail as the sound washes over you. When combined with the brilliant track design, these elements form Ridge Racer's foundation. From its original arcade experience in the early 90s and its subsequent releases on the original PlayStation, to its launch on PlayStation 2 with Ridge Racer 5, every entry has delivered a memorable racing experience. Ridge Racer makes the impossible seem possible. But then, Ridge Racer seemingly vanished, at least for a little while. You see, after years of new entries, the Ridge Racer series basically went into hibernation for more than 5 years. So, what happened? 2 words: Gran Turismo. The GT series, created by Polyphony Digital, is one of those games which comes along and changes everything. Its focus on realistic cars and driving was a smash hit. The first entries in the series were extremely popular on the PlayStation, but it was the third game on PlayStation 2 that really showcased what was possible. With its success, it's only natural then that other publishers wanted their share, and thus the rise of the realistic driving game in the console space began. Microsoft created the Forza Motorsport series, which is alive and well today. Konami tried its hand with Enthusia, professional racing on the PlayStation 2. Squaresoft published the rather anemic Driving Emotion Type S early on, and even Sega tried their hand with Sega GT on Dreamcast and Xbox. And then there was Namco, the creator of Ridge Racer. Namco also took a stab at this formula with the release of R-Racing Evolution. Developed internally using staff that had worked on Namco's own MotoGP series as well as Ridge Racer itself, R-Racing Evolution was clearly an attempt to capture the GT audience using its own sense of style. R-Racing Evolution features real cars, realistic driving, and even a full story mode peppered with full motion video like this. It was clearly not a small production. But even if it was of good quality, it really is no replacement for Ridge Racer. Arcade racing fans were left with precious few options from developers traditionally known for pushing the arcade racing genre forward by 2003. So as a fan of Ridge Racer, I remember being somewhat disappointed by the state of these things during this time, but hope was on the horizon, I would soon find out. The year 2004. The event, E3, Sony would showcase the PlayStation Portable, its first dedicated handheld system, and one of the games shown during its E3 sizzle reel was none other than a Ridge Racer game. Of course, the footage in this video is nothing more than selections from the original games, but even with this montage, it was exciting that Ridge Racer was being worked on. It would eventually be released alongside the new PlayStation Portable in Japan as of late 2004. Ridge Racers, as it would be known, was a revelation, to say the least. The concept, Ridge Racers celebrated the series' history by presenting fully rebuilt iterations of classic tracks picked from prior entries in the series, and that even includes things such as Rage Racer and Rave Racer. It features a wide range of cars, modes, and even wireless play for multiplayer action. But Namco managed to beat Ridge Racers to the market just a little before the launch of PSP with Ridge Racer DS. This game arrived just after the release of the Nintendo DS in the West. However, it was little more than a conversion of the Western-developed Ridge Racer 64, and was anything but a return to form. On its own though, it's not a bad game, but Ridge Racers on PSP. This is truly one of those rare moments in game history where you experience something for the first time and know, right then and there, that it's one of perhaps the most impressive things you've ever seen, at least in the game space. The audio and visual presentation was unlike anything else on the planet. It was a perfect fusion of Namco's art direction during the height of their power. That a racing game could look this good while running at 60 frames per second on a handheld device, it was truly mind-blowing. If you weren't there, it's difficult to appreciate just how impressive Ridge Racer truly was. The fact is, when you look at Ridge Racers, even today, it's a beautiful game. This is a game which highlights just how critical smart art design truly is. It was built within the constraints of the PSP hardware and manages to hold up brilliantly as a result. The game goes for a more subdued but appropriate color palette. You almost get the impression of a beautifully indirectly lit city or mountainside at sunrise. It looks phenomenal. Really, there's so many different elements here which were kind of cutting edge for the time and platform. Things such as the specular highlight visible across the road surface due to the sunlight. Again, this isn't really something you would have seen on fixed function hardware like the PlayStation 2, but it was becoming common on, say, the Xbox with its programmable pixel shaders. We also saw things such as the use of a render to texture feature to produce scene-accurate reflections on the player car, and even the use of faked reflection maps on the buildings. The fact is, the visuals were actually somewhat competitive in the home console space, but nothing like this had been imaginable on a portable system. But even beyond that, just the fact that the PSP had features such as bilinear texture filtering, that was something new for the era that you simply hadn't seen on a portable machine before. Ridge Racers also brought a real CD quality soundtrack to a portable system for the first time, with a wide selection of new music tracks such as the ultra catchy Disco Ball, along with some old favorites from prior games. Beyond the visuals though, this is the game that basically defined the future of Ridge Racer from this point on, for better or for worse. Handling was smoothed out and made somewhat easier, I might argue. Now, I prefer the handling in, say, Ridge Racer 5, but as a portable game, the simplified handling actually works pretty well. In addition, a nitrous system was added to the mix. Basically, you fill these canisters by drifting around corners, and when unleashed, you get a blast of speed. My only real gripe with Ridge Racers is that it's not especially challenging during the earlier races. It's very easy to get in front of the AI and just cruise around the track with no real competition. Still, Ridge Racers on PSP was one of the premier launch titles for that system, alongside the excellent Luminous, and remains a game I still enjoy to this day. It's also a game critical to the rest of the Ridge Racer story. Again, as I mentioned before, this served as a basis for the next new entry in the series, and this one goes to new places. The year is 2005, Xbox 360 was revealed to the world as the first HD-focused console. A wide range of software was being prepared to launch alongside the system later that year. But nobody was entirely sure what to expect from the machine, and some of the early reveals were interesting to say the least. It turns out though, Ridge Racer 6 would be one of those launch games, a first for the series on a non-PlayStation console. And for me, this was also an interesting time. You see, I was still living in Tokyo, circa 2005, during the lead up and the launch of Xbox 360. My first experience with Ridge Racer 6 was actually at the 360 Lounge that Microsoft had built just to showcase its next generation system. You know, when they were still trying their best to make a splash in Japan. It was here that they had an Xbox 360 attached to a Pioneer Plasma with Ridge Racer 6. It was the moment that sold me on plasma TVs, in fact, but also it showed me just what was possible in HD with a Ridge Racer game. I was ready for Ridge Racer 6. At its core then, Ridge Racer 6 takes the foundation from the PSP game with its simplified drift mechanics and boost system and combines that with an entirely new set of tracks, along with beautiful new machines and a crazy number of events in the Explorer mode, not to mention an excellent new soundtrack. When you first fire up the game, you're treated to a game of Pac-Man. You remember the Namco patent on mini-games during loading screens, right? They were still doing it during this period. I didn't mention it earlier though, but PSP also had Rally X as a mini-game at the boot of Ridge Racers. After this, however, you're greeted with a beautiful introduction movie featuring Reiko Nagase. It's a throwback to an era where intro videos could set the mood and get you hyped for the game to come. Then, as is Ridge Racer tradition, you're presented with a gorgeous menu system featuring a green and white color scheme. Beautiful smooth transitions and stylish presentation of information helps tie everything together perfectly. This joy of interface navigation seems minor, but it's one of those elements that Namco always excelled at, and this is no exception. And this taps directly into the flow of the game as well, with this lovely world explorer. Essentially, you use this hex system to traverse various races throughout the game. You can choose to link together multiple hexes to essentially create your own Grand Prix events. Digging into the world of Ridge Racer 6, you'll uncover a lot of content. If Ridge Racers on PSP was designed to take players on a nostalgia-fueled journey through the series, Ridge Racer 6 is the true follow-up. The new set of tracks were all crafted to take advantage of the more powerful Xbox 360 hardware. Moments like this in Harborline 765, where you fly around a corner at full speed, only to be greeted with this beautiful wide open vista of the city resting at the bottom of the mountain. It feels like a perfect showcase. Other great moments include the neon tunnels snaking through downtown Rave City, or the beautiful mountain roads of Highland Cliffs. Ridge Racer 6 is also the first entry in the series to offer online play, fully enabling multiplayer action that wasn't limited to split screen. So with all that in mind then, what about the presentation? This is the first time Ridge Racer entered the realm of HD after all. Ridge Racer 5 had received a lot of flack for its poor image quality at release, and in that sense, Ridge Racer 6 kind of feels like Namco's revenge, if you will. By keeping the rendering relatively simple and clean, Namco was able to deliver a high-resolution game at a stable 60 frames per second. And Ridge Racer 6 is unique in that it actually runs at 1440 by 810, a resolution beyond the 720p target of Xbox 360 games. Many other launch titles didn't even manage to hit 720p or 60 FPS, but Namco delivered both and more. Keep in mind that at launch, the 360 was limited to analog video out as well. It did not support HDMI, so 720p was the primary resolution available alongside 1080i. While Ridge Racer 6 lacks anti-aliasing, the higher resolution ensures that it's one of the cleanest games available at launch. As best as I can tell, similar to Quake 2, which was included with Quake 4 by the way, Ridge Racer 6 does actually seem to offer a slightly improved image quality when using a newer Xbox 360 with 1080p output capabilities. The pixel counts do show a 10p. Beyond this, however, the visuals are kept relatively simple but clean. There's nothing fancy about it, but the design is strong. Car models are all supremely detailed, especially for the time. The reflections are of very high quality. Programmable shaders allow for effects such as more realistic specular highlights across the road surface, as well as some beautiful bloom effects. The texture resolution and geometry density are all a step above anything else in the series past as well. The key context here is that a lot of Japanese developers struggled with this generation of hardware. There's a lot of cancelled projects out there, including Namco's own Frame City Killer. I feel that Namco's conservative approach to visuals in Ridge Racer 6, however, paid off big time. It's another example of clean, smart design winning out, and as a result, the game has aged more gracefully than many other Xbox 360 titles that would come later. And many of those games simply tried to push then new techniques at the expense of frame rate and image quality, unlike Ridge Racer 6. That said, there are some critiques I could level at the game. The color scheme is somewhat drab at times. I mean, I like the realistic tones of Ridge Racer 5 and Ridge Racers on the PSP, but some of the color choices in 6 feel just a little bit too dark. And some of the track details are also a little sparse when viewed at the intended HD resolution as well. Not a big deal in the grand scheme of things, but some of the environments definitely impress more than others. But the sound is another high point that I do want to touch on. A large selection of new music tracks were created for Ridge Racer 6, marrying both new and old Namco music staff to create them. Here's a few samples.
Another driver fired his nitrous.
Ridge Racer 6 was also the first in the series to offer Dolby Digital 5.1 support for true surround sound playback. In addition, during the race, you have 3 choices of announcer. The default one is a little bit annoying perhaps due to how often he speaks, but it also includes Heihachi from Tekken, voiced by the original Japanese actor who portrayed him. It's kinda ridiculous and awesome. So yeah, Ridge Racer 6 was an excellent launch title, and another feather in the Ridge Racer cap. It's packed with new features, tracks, and machines, along with a great new presentation, all running at a perfect 60 frames per second. It may not have been the flashiest title available for the Xbox 360 on day one, but it holds up brilliantly. Now, before we move on to the next real Ridge Racer games, we need to mention Critical Velocity. Now, this game was actually released just prior to Ridge Racer 6, but it is an interesting and noteworthy release. It's more of a spin-off in the style of the Runabout series, complete with a story and an open-world design. It was a PlayStation 2 game as well, and it looks and sounds pretty good. Of course, this is not the only time we're going to see a spin-off with Ridge Racer themes. But Namco was not done with proper Ridge Racer games. The year following the launch of Xbox 360 would feature 2 new entries in the series, so get ready. I spent the first half of 2006 playing a lot of Ridge Racer 6. I bought my first plasma TV, and Ridge Racer 6 was my game of choice. So when it was announced that there would be a Ridge Racer 7 released just 1 year later, I paid attention. Now, Ridge Racer 7 was first shown at E3 2006 via this teaser trailer. No gameplay footage was revealed, but it was shown as being in development for the PlayStation 3 as a launch title. The thing is, E3 2006 is kind of a pivotal moment in the history of the PlayStation 3. This is the infamous conference that gave birth to Giant Enemy Crab, $5.99 US, and Ridge Racer, among many others. The hype around the PS3 was significant at the time, so this conference was kind of something that set a different than expected tone for the launch of the system that would follow in the fall. So yeah, it wasn't entirely clear at the time what Ridge Racer 7 would be or how it would actually turn out. But before we answer that question, Namco had something else lined up, Ridge Racers 2 on the PSP. Now, with a name like that, you'd expect a proper sequel, but in a throwback of sorts to that arcade version of Ridge Racer 2 or Ridge Racer Revolution on the PlayStation, which were basically the same as the originals with some different tracks, this PSP release is more of an expansion pack than anything else. Essentially, it's the exact same game, with the remaining pre-2000 era Ridge Racer tracks that were missing in the original, along with new music and some additional new features. Now that sounds a little bad on paper, and yeah, there was initial disappointment surrounding it, but in reality, this is basically the most complete version of this game. Every single PS1 and arcade-era Ridge Racer track is in the game, and it rules. The visuals are mostly identical to the original, but there's a new soft bloom added to the mix. It's subtle, but it looks nice, and the game still looked amazing at the time of release. Ultimately, the extra content means that this is basically the biggest Ridge Racer game available, and one of my favorite installments in the series. It basically renders the original PSP release obsolete as a result, which is perhaps why it was never released in North America. This one is exclusive to Japan and Europe. This sort of release, however, acted as a sort of harbinger of what was to come with Ridge Racer 7 when it launched alongside the PlayStation 3 later that year. This is Ridge Racer 7, the complete version of Ridge Racer 6, if you will. Essentially, this is also an expanded and enhanced version of the Xbox 360 game, released 1 year later for PS3. But unlike Ridge Racers 2, it features a whole slew of brand new and beautiful tracks, an entirely fresh soundtrack, a revamped menu and career system, and greatly enhanced visuals. So where do we start? Well, firstly, this time, Namco has included another minigame. Xevious appears at the startup, which is neat, but after that, there's no intro movie, just straight to the main menu. Once there though, you're greeted with an equally stylish front-end system that feels suitably polished. But if you dig into the options menu, there's a curious feature awaiting you, the option to install the game to your hard drive. Yes, Ridge Racer 7, along with a few other launch titles such as Genji Days of the Blade, gave players the option to install the game to the hard drive to cut down on loading times. But what's unique about this installation is that they actually allow you to play a game of Xevious while you wait for the game data to install to your hard drive. One of the best uses I've seen of the Namco minigame concept, I suppose. Now, the career mode does away with the Explorer feature from Ridge Racer 6 and instead offers this. Basically a world map with a series of race icons that appears as you progress. Along the bottom is a ticker of sorts showing information highlighting the activities of other players. Namco had wanted to build this kind of system that makes you feel as if you're surrounded by other Ridge Racer players, even when playing the single player campaign. It kinda works, but the data today is perhaps not the most useful. Once you start the game though, prepare your senses, because Ridge Racer 7 is one of the very first 1080p 60 frames per second games released on a console, and it's glorious. But here's the thing, with Ridge 7, Namco basically became one of the only developers in the history of the PlayStation 3 to achieve the build 1080p 60 dream. They weren't the only ones, mind you, but typically this was reserved for smaller games. At least at launch, we didn't even know how many issues developers would wind up having while creating games for the PlayStation 3. But that's just part of what makes the presentation here so effective. Namco went back and basically enhanced every track from Ridge Racer 6. There's new geometry, modified lighting, brighter colors, and improved detail everywhere. It may feature all of his original tracks, but everything has been touched up. And that's interesting since, as the generation would continue, Xbox 360 almost always had the upper hand when it came to multi-platform releases. Ridge Racer 7 is, in effect, an anomaly, especially for a title released so early in its life cycle. This is where we can finally dig into the first real PlayStation 3 and 360 comparison, at least one of the first. You see, we have two games here. Both target 60 frames per second, but Ridge Racer 7 is native 1080p. Ridge Racer 6 in comparison is 810p, but the difference goes a lot deeper than mere resolution numbers. The most obvious change here stems from the way in which everything is lit and colored. Ridge Racer 7 goes for a more vibrant, strong appearance, a look that almost screams for HDR on a television, which didn't exist at the time, of course. Ridge Racer 6 in comparison tends towards a more muted style with a stronger bloom component. It's an interesting comparison because it's not really just a tech comparison, rather it's a complete shift in the art design and philosophy behind the game. Unfortunately, there's little to no information out there that I could locate with actual insight from the developers, but my guess is that they simply wanted Ridge Racer 7 to have a more vibrant, almost arcade-like appearance to differentiate it from 6. And this is especially evident when you look at the new tracks. Those with the tropical theme in particular are extremely vibrant and colorful. This seems to have influenced the redesign of the rest of the game's tracks as well. Now, there are a few differences I noted in terms of overall detail levels then. Ridge Racer 7, for instance, now features blowing flags and signs, as well as an increase in the amount of confetti being thrown around at various points along the track. Not a big deal, necessarily, but it does add some additional life into these stages. In addition, Ridge Racer 7 also adds ground reflections. They're of relatively low resolution, but they can be effective. It's obviously most visible in these new tracks, but several of the tracks pulled from Ridge Racer 6 also benefit as well. By and large, the overall track detail is consistent, but Namco did touch up certain environments. For instance, Surfside Resort. If you look at the distant mountains here, Ridge Racer 7 features completely revamped terrain, rather than the sparse terrain that you see in Ridge Racer 6, which looks somewhat unfinished in comparison. In another track set at dusk, the developers added additional lights for Ridge 7. The street lamps are actually lit in both games, but in Ridge 6 there is no illumination, leading to a somewhat flat-looking track, I think. Then there's the tunnel section, which occurs later in the track, which is, again, much more vibrant in Ridge 7, something that kind of applies to most of the stages here. Now, in another track, the artists actually touched up the texture work and added moving clouds into the mix. Which one you prefer, though, will almost certainly come down to personal preference. There are some areas where I actually slightly prefer the look of Ridge 6, for instance, such as the urban section during Harbor Line 765. The strong bloom and color use here look really good on Xbox 360, though in reality they both look pretty good. You also notice differences such as the camera placement being slightly pulled back in Ridge Racer 7, or the way the cars move when they take to the air. In Ridge Racer 7, there's sort of an arc to the jump that's lacking in Ridge Racer 6. Overall, I do feel like Ridge Racer 7 is basically a refined and expanded version of the Xbox 360 original, but the fact that it does look somewhat better while running at a higher resolution is at odds with basically every other multi-platform release at the time. I mean, this is a time when Call of Duty 3 launched at 60 frames per second on Xbox 360, but was only 30 on the PS3. Same deal for games like Madden. What Namco pulled off here feels almost miraculous given the context. But there is kind of a wrinkle here. Not everyone could enjoy the game at full fidelity right away. Ridge Racer 7 sort of highlights one of the issues with PlayStation 3. It didn't include a universal hardware scaling solution. The approach differs per game, but in the case of Ridge Racer 7, it seems like the rendering resolution of the game is determined by the output of the system. You only get native 1080p when using 1080p output, and 1080p displays at this time were extremely rare and expensive. So it actually took years for some of us to experience it in its full fidelity. Then there's the audio. Like the 360 game, Ridge Racer 7 supports full surround sound, but this time offers 7.1 channel support. The sound in Ridge Racer 7 is generally amazing, with a stunning new soundtrack featuring some great new tracks such as this. But alas, there's one serious flaw: the sound of the engines. I'm not sure what the development team had in mind here, but effectively the cars in Ridge Racer 7 sound more like lawnmowers than actual racing machines, and I found it often distracting. Take a listen.
Good luck.
Ridge Racer 6 in comparison is much more palatable, I think. Still, overall, Ridge Racer 7 is the more complete and polished of the two games. It occupies a space similar to Ridge Racers 2 on PSP, but there's so much more content here and it feels like a proper follow-up. Ridge Racer 6 is still worth playing, of course, but I feel that Ridge 7 just offers a better overall experience, and it remains one of my favorite games on PlayStation 3. Alas, hints of 1080p 60 gameplay with bright, beautiful graphics quickly faded once the generation got underway, making Ridge Racer 7 a truly unique release for the console. And this is why it holds up better than most other games on the platform. Unfortunately, the series would never again reach the heights of Ridge Racer 7. In fact, the future of the series is honestly rather bleak, even if we didn't know it at the time. Pachi slot, where good games go to die, or at least it sure seems that way sometimes. Like many other famous series from Japan, Ridge Racer was spun off into two Pachi slot machines, one in 2008 and the other in 2009. In that machine, it received a conversion of sorts for the PlayStation 2. Yes, this is Yamasa DigiWorld, collaboration SP Pachi slot Ridge Racer for PlayStation 2, released in 2008. And it's pretty much exactly what you'd expect. So, to begin with, yes, it does have this nice FMV introduction, which is kind of interesting at least. Alas, when it comes to the Pachi slot gameplay itself, I am no expert, so I really can't say much about the quality of this particular game. I bet it's amazing if you love Pachi slot. I don't, but at least the presentation is certainly nice and sort of resembles Ridge Racer 5 in some ways, apart from the more modern car. It's pretty much exactly what you would expect from a Pachi slot game based on Ridge Racer. The next actual Ridge Racer game, however, came in a different form, as an iOS release for the iPhone and iPod Touch back in 2009. Ridge Racer Accelerated, as it was known, is basically a mobile adaptation of the PSP games with microtransactions. Unfortunately, the game is no longer compatible with modern iOS devices, so I'm not actually able to capture it and play it for myself. I did have this on my iPhone back in the day though, and I don't remember it being that great compared to the PSP versions. But there was another mobile game released during this era for various other lower end devices called Ridge Racer Drift. Now I'm running this here via an emulator on the PC, but it should give you an idea of what you can expect from this. The game was made available for various devices with variable screen resolutions and power, but the result is pretty much the same. The game is not good. Now, of course, there are strict limitations to consider technically that would prevent this from even delivering something truly impressive, but keep in mind that this was released 7 years after the Nokia N-Gage, which delivered numerous PS1 3D conversions with far more impressive results than this. In fact, Ridge Racer Drift is just kind of hilariously awful in comparison. The game draws very simplistic flat-shaded polygon graphics, with objects represented as sprites. Now there's no reason this setup couldn't work. There have been simple polygon racers that look great, and games like Outrun rely entirely on sprites, and they look great. This is just a case where the design and implementation is simply poor. It also has kind of a weird vibe that is weirdly reminiscent of an Atari Jaguar homebrew release. I mean, just listen to this music and tell me if this isn't Jaguar. Of course, it may actually sound a little different on actual phones depending on the hardware, but yeah. Now, of course, this is basically just a Java game as best as I can tell, and none of this hardware was really designed for serious gaming in the first place, but it's definitely a case where it just wasn't worth the development time at all. This is a bad game, plain and simple. I've played much better games on hardware of this class. At this point then, Ridge Racer was not in good shape. Mediocre to poor mobile games and 2 Pachi slot machines kind of feels like the end, but thankfully, Namco still had a couple of decent games up its sleeves.
Everyone, this is Nintendo 3DS.
The year was 2011. A new Nintendo handheld was on the horizon, but this time with a twist. It would offer stereoscopic 3D. Of course, I'm talking about the Nintendo 3DS. It wasn't a huge success out of the gate, but it did launch with its very own Ridge Racer game. And you know what? It's pretty good. Ridge Racer 3D is effectively Ridge Racers 3, a new game built primarily around classic tracks from the series past, but with a handful of new tracks and content on top. It has this vast Grand Prix mode to explore with a series of races which unlock more vehicles and features. There's also options for generating a race based on your desired playtime, among others, something that's kind of interesting for a mobile game, I think. The core gameplay is very much in line with the likes of Ridge Racer 7. You still have nitrous as well as the Slipstream system which we saw in Ridge Racer 7. Drifting still feels sublime and somewhat simplistic as it has since Ridge Racers on PSP, and the sheer volume of tracks included in this release provide a ton of fun. Visually, Ridge Racer 3D aims for a look that shares more in common with the original Ridge Racer, I might venture, rather than the more subdued, natural look that became standard following Ridge Racer Type 4. It uses these bold, primary colors with plenty of eye-popping detail. Quite literally, in fact, as the game's big visual selling point is the stereoscopic 3D, of course. The effect is convincing too, especially with the taillight trails seemingly popping out of the screen as you drive. It all adds a lot of depth to the experience and it gives you a new perspective on Ridge Racer. But unfortunately, all of this comes with a steep cost, and that is performance. Ridge Racer 3D is limited to 30 frames per second, and the reflections on the cars update at a fraction of that. Plus, they're unfiltered and super pixelated. It basically fails to look anywhere near as fluid as the prior decade worth of Ridge Racer games as a result. Honestly, when compared to the PSP Ridge Racers game, which by the way launched on hardware from 2004, the 3D game kind of falls down as a result of the lower frame rate and chunky details in spots. Sure, there's some elements that seem slightly more detailed, and it does feature tracks that were created for Xbox 360 and PS3, but the garish colors and lower performance detract from the overall visual impression. The 60 frames per second of the PSP game enhances the experience so dramatically, and going back to 30 doesn't cut it, at least for me. The tracks that are shared with PSP also look remarkably similar in terms of overall scene geometry, even if the cars themselves are improved. There's also a lot of other effects such as intense bloom lighting and some blurring that is used when you use your nitrous. The 3D is used to great effect in some scenes though, such as leaves smacking against the screen, or when you drive through water, you get splashes. As expected, it doesn't compare favorably against Ridge Racer 6 or 7, which feature more detail and of course higher performance, but we didn't expect the 3DS to match a 360 or PS3, right? In a way, it almost gives us a look at what these tracks may have looked like if they had been translated to the PSP for a Ridge Racers 3 had it existed. It's interesting to see how they compare though, and it's great having these tracks available on a portable system. But perhaps I'm being just a little bit harsh here, because frame rate aside, Ridge Racer 3D is actually a solid entry. It's not like the PS1 original games were 60 FPS, right? At least aside from Ridge Racer High Spec. It's still perfectly playable in that sense, and the stereoscopic 3D adds a lot to the overall experience. It has a new soundtrack as well, though this soundtrack has more of a rock style as opposed to the electronic sound of the prior games. Take a listen. Still, while Ridge Racer 3D doesn't quite reach the peak of the series, it's perhaps the last great game in the franchise, and I definitely recommend checking it out. But the next Ridge Racer game would arrive the following year, this time on Sony's next generation portable, the PlayStation Vita. And this should have been a return to form, but somehow it all kinda went wrong, at least partially. This is Ridge Racer for PS Vita. It's both a good game and one of the most disappointing games I've ever purchased. So what do I mean by that? Well, firstly, before we answer the question, it should be noted that this is the first and only game released by Celius, a joint venture between Sony and Namco, headed by none other than Ken Kutaragi himself. It was formed in 2007 to build content for the PlayStation 3, but alas, this never happened, and instead, this Vita launch title is its only release. Fundamentally, Ridge Racer is actually a good game. The core driving experience feels great, the game looks gorgeous, and the soundtrack is absolutely superb. Problem is, there's barely any content here, at least by default. Yes, Ridge Racer only ships with just 3 tracks and a handful of cars. Now, there are 6 other tracks available, but only as downloadable content. The same goes for add-on cars and music. Each piece of DLC is its own standalone download as well, which is a nightmare in the context of Vita's download system. I purchased the retail card of the game back at launch, which even has the nerve to include a voucher for downloading these additional tracks rather than just including them on the game card itself. A huge disappointment. But okay, you say, the original Ridge Racer on PlayStation only had variants of one track, John. What's the problem here? Well, aside from the fact that the series had evolved significantly by 2011, there isn't much in the way of progression in this game. The single player mode is basically limited to single races and time attacks, and that's about it. In fact, most of the game was supposed to focus on the multiplayer, but that's not really running today either. No matter how you play though, it never feels cohesive in any way, and there's certainly no sense of progression here. The second issue though lies in performance. Like Ridge Racer 3D, the Vita game is limited to just 30 frames per second, which honestly isn't acceptable given the history of the series on a portable PlayStation. Even worse, the frame rate isn't even completely stable, at least without overclocking your Vita. It also runs at a resolution lower than the Vita's native panel, which is equally disappointing. At least the visuals themselves are actually quite good if you can overlook these flaws. It's a nice mixture of Ridge Racer 6, 7, and 3D tracks, all redone for the PS Vita. The lighting and detail levels are actually really impressive, and the car models look fabulous. Some tracks also use this lovely depth of field effect for distant scenery, which I'm way into. This kind of feels like a game that perfects the look of the visuals that started with Ridge Racer 6. It's just a shame that we don't get to enjoy them at 60 frames per second. Now, it did receive some interesting bonus DLC at least, including The Hornet from Daytona USA, and this amazing rendition of the Ridge Racer theme as sung by Sega's own Takenobu Mitsuyoshi. Take a listen.
Push to the edge. I can lose. Ridge Racer. I own the future. Never look back. Do you know how to put that pedal to the metal?
And yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the rest of the soundtrack is phenomenal. So that's the thing here. There's a lot of flaws in this release and many things you need to overlook in order to enjoy it. But if you can, there's still a good game at its core here. This is a game that feels like it needed at least another 6 months of development and some additional thought poured into event availability. As it stands, however, it remains a huge disappointment for me, but at least it's a game I can still enjoy from time to time. We're not done yet though. 1 year later, yet another Ridge Racer game was released, and this one is perhaps the most divisive yet. I'm talking about Ridge Racer Unbounded from Bugbear Entertainment. You know, the developers of Flatout and Wreckfest? Yeah, that Bugbear. In what is one of the strangest partnerships I can remember, these guys managed to get a hold of the Ridge Racer license and produce a rather fascinating game in the process. Now, when it was first teased, the reaction wasn't exactly positive. The trailer had a darker, grittier theme that seemed at odds with what the series had been known for, but I was still interested and I gave it a shot. And you know what? It's actually a good racing game, just not necessarily a good Ridge Racer game. So as the teaser suggested, this is a game about aggression. You do drift around corners, sure, but the meter that you fill actually unleashes this power move, which you can use to either destroy your opponents, Burnout style, or blast through these buildings. It's a dark, dingy world packed full of bloom lighting and filthy streets. The campaign, if you will, has you racing through all these different environments, earning more points to unlock more events. There's also a track editor feature, which is neat, where you basically place blocks down on a grid to form your track. Then you can fly around and add extra hazards, jumps, and scenery to the mix. It's a really cool way to expand the game, and it is fun to toy around with, but ultimately it has the side effect of kind of revealing a little too much about the way the game works and the tracks are designed. Fundamentally, that's the issue. The track designs are fine enough, I suppose, but they're mostly lacking that soul of a classic Ridge Racer game. I mean, you look at something like the iconic Seaside Route 765 with its gorgeous beachfront, corners, and urban sections. It's a track you'll never forget. There's a ton of variety and careful design poured into classic Ridge Racer tracks that's just absent here. With Unbounded, everything kind of feels like it was pieced together using these level chunks, and it's all encased within these city blocks. You never really get that variety you expect from a Ridge Racer. That said, it is interesting, at least technically. What you're looking at now is the PC version of the game. This is the best version of Ridge Racer Unbounded, due primarily to its high frame rate, fast loading, and higher resolutions. But the console version was disappointing at the time. Like the last couple of games, it is also limited to 30 frames per second and at a lower resolution, making it a step down from the likes of Ridge Racer 7 despite the increased visual detail. Still, on PC at least, it is a very nice looking game, just not much of a Ridge Racer game. It has the tone reminiscent of something like Burnout Revenge more than Ridge Racer, really. The soundtrack is also kind of a weird mishmash of songs from prior games, some new licensed tracks from artists such as Skrillex, and a handful of new songs from the original sound team that worked on prior Ridge Racer games, some of which are really good, by the way. So yeah, this was a weird one. It's a fun game, and it looks great, at least on PC, but it just never really captured me like a classic Ridge Racer game should. Driving through cement pillars is fun and all, but this is just a different sort of game, and one that I don't quite enjoy as much as I'd like. At one point, Namco had planned to release a free-to-play version of this game called Driftopia with microtransactions. It made it to beta stage, but it was canned. It's a similar concept to what Namco did with Ace Combat and Soul Calibur, I'd say, and it's probably for the better that it was canned. Alas, at this point, the next generation of consoles were on the horizon. PlayStation 4 and Xbox One would launch a year and some change after the arrival of Unbounded, but unfortunately, there was no Ridge Racer game at launch. This would be the first time in series history that Ridge Racer would miss the launch of a PlayStation console. The world was worse off for it. That's not to say Ridge Racer didn't get a 2013 release though. Namco unleashed yet another mobile game, this time called Ridge Racer Slipstream for iOS and Android. It's effectively a mobile version of Ridge Racer 7, but packed full of microtransactions, currencies, and all that stuff that you expect from a mobile game. It kinda ruins the flow. Everything here is limited by this system. The move to mobile kind of destroys the game's pacing, and that's a real shame because aside from that, it looks and plays shockingly well. Well, at least today, I should add. I remember downloading it when it was still new, and it didn't run well on the then new iPhone 5. On a modern phone though, like my iPhone 11 Pro Max here, the game delivers a nice stable 60 frames per second, and honestly it looks really good. It looks so good, in fact, that I kind of feel like this could work on the Switch if released today. Alas, it's also been removed from the store, but since I had played it before, I was able to download it, and it had been updated to work on a modern iOS device, which is good. 3 years later then, yet another mobile release hit the market. Ridge Racer Draw and Drift. Unfortunately, it's long been since removed from the App Store, and I never downloaded it, so I I haven't had a chance to try it. I couldn't even get the APK to work on an Android emulator. Honestly, I have no idea how the game plays aside from watching this trailer, and that comes down to the awful mobile situation. Again, mobile games seem to be flat out disposable in the eyes of publishers. Yes, the APK is out there for Android, but getting it to run is another story. It's a shame that 2 of the 4 mobile games mentioned today were basically unplayable for me, but I think it says a lot about the state of mobile gaming. And that's what makes the ending of Ridge Racer so sad. The series ended not with a bang, but a whimper. A mostly forgotten, now removed pair of mobile games is all that really remains. While Namco has had a lot of success in reviving many of its other series, Ridge Racer remains dormant. There were rumors of a Ridge Racer 8 in development, but sadly, that never came to pass, and yet another PlayStation has launched without a Ridge Racer.
Here he comes again, running like the open wind. Yeah, moving through the day, take the legion, know he's on his way. Can you feel the heat when the tires hit the street, moving to the beat? All alone is the only way that he wants to play. Hear me say his name. Step back into Tracer of the Tracer. He gives me what I need. One more win into Tracer of the Tracer.
Is the dream truly dead? Well, not entirely. There are some people keeping it alive, at least in spirit. Kota Takahashi, for instance, a famed game composer and longtime contributor to Namco's classic franchises such as Klonoa and Ridge Racer, released a track in mid-2021 in the spirit of Ridge Racer Type 4. It sounds incredible. One could only dare to dream what a full soundtrack would sound like if he had a chance to return to a full Ridge Racer production again, at least based on this single track. In addition, the iconic red car from Ridge Racer also makes an appearance in Astra's Playroom on the PlayStation 5, suggesting that Sony themselves have at least not completely forgotten about the legendary debut and what it meant for the very first PlayStation. But aside from things like this, the Ridge Racer scene is all but finished. There's no real evidence of it making a return at this point outside of a rumor here or there of compilations, so all we can do is hope and keep our memories alive. For me, nearly 30 years after Ridge Racer first debuted, it's remained a series that I enjoy and think about regularly. Ridge City is a place of comfort, the beautiful tracks, the music, the drifting. It takes you to another world, another time. Much like driving on an afternoon with the sun setting in the rearview mirror and synthwave music playing on the stereo, bringing you back to a time gone by, playing Ridge Racer is a ride back to a simpler time as well. One with as much gravity, twists, and turns as any other medium, and one that still to this day shows you that the perfect balance between the simplicity of efficient design and the complexity of a classic arcade game can still provide joy, and none of them do it better than Ridge Racer. This is the joy of Ridge Racer, and hopefully someday the city will once again be ours.